evening, as appropriate to your location, and I know we have people from all over the world here. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Paul Hall, and I will be moderating today's presentation. Before I begin, I just wanted to mention that you will be receiving a short 4 to 5 question evaluation survey via email after the webinar. This survey is important in that it is a mechanism by which you can provide feedback to us on both the content and the format of these webinars so that we can continue to improve them. When you receive it, please do take a moment to answer the questions and submit your responses to us. Thank you. Today, Jim Miller will be speaking to you about impending changes to the regulations governing storage tank fittings. Jim is a senior air quality consultant at RPS. He has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from UT Austin and has expertise with a variety of tank emission software packages, including EPA's tanks software and proprietary software such as Tank ESP. After the presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions of Jim by typing them into the chat window. And with that, I give you Jim Miller. Jim?
Thank you, Paul. Hello again, everyone. I'm glad you could join us. As mentioned, today's webinar is going to be focused on recent changes to the U.S. EPA's Refinery MACT rule, and I'll talk about the structure of the EPA rules for those of you who may not be familiar with those later. But today's topic is going to be specific to organic liquid storage tanks, applicability and control requirements. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Jim Miller. I have over 11 years consulting experience in air quality. Some of my first tasks include regulatory auditing for Title V compliance at multiple refineries, and those audits, of course, included storage tanks. I'm also a storage tank emission calculation subject matter expert. I've traveled the country doing in-house training, assisting with training at environmental conferences, and I've published and presented at multiple conferences for both environmental trade groups and for environmental agencies. I also have managed multiple reporting, regulatory compliance, emissions reporting, air permitting projects, all of those involving storage tanks. So I've been doing this for several years, and I've been following this rule very closely recently. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Peace for facilitating this webinar. Peace is a part of RPS training. They provide practical professional career training for the petroleum and oil and gas industries. Training is available for upstream, midstream, and downstream operations, and the topics range from technical, engineering, and science to management, and can be structured for basic as well as skilled applications. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to go over some of the rule basics. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has published their environmental rules under Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Typical refineries, and we're going to be talking specifically about refineries today, those tend to be the precursor or the first industry that gets hit on certain rule changes. So these tend to portend changes coming for other industries. The structure of most of the regulatory drivers for refineries specific to air quality are going to be under Part 60, which is the Standards of Performance for New Stationary Sources, also known as the New Source Performance Standards, or NSPS. We'll be talking specifically today a lot about NSPS K, KA, and KB, which are specific to storage tanks. Part 61 are the National Emissions Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or NESHAPs. And those typically would be NESHAPs FF or NESHAPs Y, specific to benzene storage or benzene wastewater handling. And Part 63 under Title 40 are the NESHAPs for source categories, And this is where the refinery MACT is published, MACT standing for Maximum Achievable Control Technology. And again, these are source categories that are going to be specific to the type of the unit or process unit or the type of source that the individual emission point is located. So when we look at Part 60, the definition of source, when they say new source performance standards, those sources are going to be emission source specific. So the storage tank would be considered the source. When you talk about the source categories in Part 63, those sources are going to be considered the entire site is the source. So a refinery would be categorized as the source, where each individual storage tank supporting that refinery, located at that refinery, would not be considered the source under that definition. Under MACT CC, again, 40 CFR 63, subpart CC, the original rule was published back in '95, and there have been several changes throughout the years, and you can look under the Federal Register here. I have all of the changes that were made over the years listed here. The most recent of which, being the one that we're interested in today, was published December 1st, 2015. And because of those changes, there are some major applicability and control requirements that may be triggered. So again, when we look at the control requirements for storage tanks, we need to make sure that we are talking about the correct talking about the applicable tanks at the site. The MACT structure is set up such that you have a Group 1 storage tank and a Group 2 storage tank definition. Group 1 storage tanks will be required to comply with all of the controls, monitoring, record keeping, and reporting. Group 2 storage tanks are going to be everything that is not defined as a Group 1 storage tank, and those will be exempt from the add-on controls and reporting and record-keeping requirements. So under the definition of Group 1 storage tank, for an existing refinery, this is a refinery that was built prior to 2014, these volume constraints used to be, the volume cutoff used to be anything greater than or equal to 47,000 gallons would be applicable. Now the EPA has changed that to have two different volume cutoffs. One is from 20,000 gallons to 40,000 gallons, and the other being anything greater than or equal to 40,000 gallons. So now, whereas before if you were below 47,000 gallons, you were automatically exempt from Group 1 status, now you have to look at only anything below 20,000 gallons will be automatically exempt. Additionally, the vapor pressure requirements for things greater than 40,000 gallons have changed, and you can see the old standard was 1.5 psi on a maximum basis, or 1.2 psi, pounds per square inch, on an average basis vapor pressure. Now anything on a storage tank greater than 40,000 gallons and greater than 0.75 psia was potentially subject, and anything between 20,000 and 40,000 gallons greater than 1.9 psi is potentially subject. Again, for an existing refinery, the HAPS concentration of 4 liquid weight percent is the cutoff. So you can see that here you're going to have potential to capture a lot more storage tanks between greater than 20,000 gallons and less than 47,000 gallons that were originally exempt, and a lot of storage tanks that are greater than 0.75 psia vapor pressure, storage vapor pressure, are potentially going to be captured. For a new refinery or a reconstructed refinery, the definition is different. Again, there are very few new refineries in the U.S. The only ones that I know of in the last couple years that are being built now as new refineries are the condensate splitter units at several terminal facilities that will enable them to take the shale crude condensate and process them further to additional refined products for further shipping. I know of a couple of them recently that have gotten the applicability determination from the EPA that they will be subject to MACT CC and they will be treated as a refinery process unit. So any storage tanks that are impacting those or feeding or handling products from that condensate splitter unit is going to have to comply with this definition for Group 1 storage tank. And the main change here is, as you can see, the previous MACT had the breakdown from 20 to 40 and anything greater than 40. Those haven't changed, but the vapor pressure requirement for tanks between 20,000 and 40,000 gallons has gone from 11.1 psi to 1.9 psi. So that's basically just almost every product that is going to be required to be in a floating roof tank is going to potentially be subject. So now, once we've determined which Group 1 storage tanks you have at your site, whether it's existing or a new site, then they have some exemptions here for which control strategies you're allowed to choose. If you're an existing or new storage tank or a new facility and you have a Group 1 storage tank and it's also subject to the new source performance standard KB, then you can elect to continue to comply with KB with some exemptions for delaying repair and for delaying of inspections, and some clarification on guide pole controls, meaning that you have to comply with the no visible gap requirement for your guide poles. So you can either comply with KB with these minor exemptions, or you can elect to comply with the MACT WW, which is the uniform storage tank regulation. So you can elect to comply with either. If you're also subject to NESHAP Y, which again is the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants for benzene, these are specific to benzene storage tanks, then you can elect to comply with either subpart Y, or you can elect to adopt the MACT WW. If you are a Group 1 storage tank at an existing source, and that's several of these several of the refineries out there will be an existing source, and you're also subject to NSPS-K or KA. These are the rules, the new source performance standards for storage tanks that came out prior to KB. Then you'd be required to comply with MACT-CC, which references MACT WW. So these new updated fitting requirements would be applicable to those tanks specifically, if you're electing to comply with WW. Group 2 storage tanks at existing facilities, if you're subject to KB, then you're required to comply with KB. If you're subject to NESHAP Y, then you're required to comply with NESHAP Y. If you're at a new source and you are applicable to NSPS KB, but you were not required to apply controls under KB, then your applicability under MACT-CC will be now MACT WW is going to trump. So you're going to have to look out for any Group 2 storage tanks at your new sources that were not required to comply controls. Now you're going to have to look at the WW applicability. And same with NESHAP Y. You'll have to comply with WW. So the previous MACT, Refinery MACT-CC referenced subpart G for the non-NSPS KB tanks. Now they're going to be referencing WW with some additional clarifications. And because of these MACT WW issues, they're going to be requiring potentially new fittings. Before we talk about those fittings, however, I'm going to ask you guys a quick poll, have a quick poll here. How many of your organic liquid storage tanks do you think are applicable to NSPS KB? If you could take. So typical refineries in the country are going to be around between greater than 50%, probably more often greater than 75%. That means that typically anywhere from 25 to 50% of those storage tanks that are not applicable to KB will have to have this analysis performed. Additionally, it's beneficial while you're performing these analyses to ensure that even though it is a KB tank, to ensure that those controls are actually in place, because a lot of times, what you have in your paperwork doesn't match what's in the field. So for those of you who don't have an idea, the couple of you out there who don't know, I would suggest getting a quick audit started to make sure that you know and look at what the applicability determinations are for NSPSKB and do a quick review there. Once you've determined how many of your storage tanks are going to be requiring these subpart WW controls, then it's important to understand what is out there, what has been required to be out there in the past for MACT previously exempted some of these the floating roof storage fittings from having the well that extends below the liquid surface. Now MACT under referenced by WW or referencing WW is going to require all openings except for vacuum breakers and rim vents to extend below the liquid surface. So I'm going to show you a quick picture here. Here's a fitting, an access hatch that, if you imagine, is not floating, the roof is not floating on the liquid surface, and you do not have this well extended below, then you could potentially have the entire liquid surface area communicating with the underside of that access hatch and have a pathway for emissions. So the purpose of having that well extend below the liquid surface is to minimize the liquid surface area and vapor space available to communicate with that fitting. So all fittings except for vacuum breakers and rim vents are going to be required to be extended below the liquid surface. For well covers, all covers on these wells were previously exempted from being gasketed. Now all the covers have to have gaskets that meet a maximum of 1/8 inch gap threshold, and all covers must be closed at all times unless you're opening the cover to access the inside of that fitting. For the vacuum breakers and rim vents, the previous MACT exempted them from being gasketed also, but now those have to be gasketed, and here I have the example of the rim vent. This is why they're not required to be extended below the liquid surface, is because you can see it opens up this. It opens into the annular space underneath a rim seal, and at the top of this vent you have this cover, and that is going to be required to be gasketed. Here is your vacuum breaker. That will not be required to extend into the liquid surface. However, you will be required to have a gasket that goes around this entire cover. For column wells, these are the support columns for a fixed roof tank, for an internal floating roof tank that has a floater inside a fixed roof tank. In order to support the fixed roof structure at the top of the tank, you have to have these columns in place, and those will be required to go through the floating roof tank, and so you'll have a well that surrounds them on the floating roof tank. And that cover used to be exempt from any controls on those under MACT. Now that cover is going to be required to either be gasketed or to be a flexible fabric sleeve. Now I haven't shown a sleeve here, but basically what it would look like is a fabric seal that goes from the top of this well and hugs around the support column and basically minimizes the surface area underneath this cover. Additionally, sample wells were exempt from controls. Now all the sample wells are required to be either covered and gasketed. You can see here what a typical FEEF hatch or a kick hatch where you can or a kick plate where you can kick this open and go down on the roof, kick it open, put your sample bomb in there and pull it out. That is now going to be required to be gasketed. Additionally, your sample, the slit covering is going to be required to be either 90% covered or have this cover. So if you have this funnel here, will allow you to stand at the top of the observation deck, aim for that funnel, drop your bomb sample down in there, go through the slits, pull your sample back up, and those slits should come back into place and cover at least 90% of that opening. Those were previously exempt. Now you're going to have these covers. To have bolts or other fasteners to keep those in place during operation, during routine operation. Unslotted guide poles were exempted from controls under MACT-CC. Now you're going to have to either have a pole wiper and a gasketed cap at the top of the guide pole. And I'll show you a picture here. This unslotted guide pole has, if you imagine that thief hatch, that kick hatch that I showed again, and this pole extending all the way to the top of the observation deck, having that hatch at the top would constitute the cover. And then here you've got your cover is going to be required to be, the well cover is going to be required to be gasketed, as mentioned before, but you're also going to be required to have a pole wiper, which goes around the inner space of that cover and basically wipes the pole down as the liquid level is drained. Slotted guide poles were also exempted from control under MACT-CC. Now you're going to be required to have all the slotted guide poles with either a pole wiper and a pole sleeve, or a pole wiper and pole float, or a flexible enclosure around the outside above the floating roof and the cap or gasketed cover at the top of the pole. Now that flexible enclosure will basically turn the slotted guide pole into an unslotted guide pole, because there will be no slots above the roof because it would be enclosed by the flexible enclosure. I don't have a picture of that here, but if you can imagine for this slotted guide pole, the liquid surface here, it could evaporate and the vapors can come out of the holes under the deck and come above the deck and escape through those holes above. So the purpose for the wiper and the gasket and the float is to block the pathway for those emissions and minimize that pathway for the emissions to come into the holes underneath the deck and escape the holes at the top. So this would be an example of a wiper and a float, and the float has to extend above the wiper. You see the float on the right side here is below the wiper, but you also have a pole sleeve in place, and that would be okay because the sleeve here is going to basically prevent the vapors in this vapor space to migrate out of those holes. Additionally, ladders that were equipped with slotted legs acted as slotted guide poles, or can act as similar to slotted guide poles, and in their emissions characteristics, and so those were not addressed in MACT-CC. Now they're going to be required to have similar controls as a slotted guide pole, as a wiper and either a float in the slotted leg, or wipers and the sleeve, or a flexible enclosure with gasket and weld at the top of that slotted pole. So before we go and do this last, we'll talk about the compliance schedule here. There's an effective date for the rule. It's February 1st of 2016. It's coming right around the corner. There's a schedule for all of the storage tanks listed in MACT-CC Appendices Table 11. Note that those have been updated, and so you have a new Table 11 there, and they're based on the construction date of your refinery, or the last reconstruction date of the refinery. And since most refineries were constructed prior to 1994, I've included the snapshot here, but make sure you go to Table 11 for a more detailed list for the existing refineries and for the tanks that must comply with 63640, which is the general requirements, and 63646, which are the old storage tank standards, which include the reference to KB. Those are required to comply by January 30th, 2019. For the new 660 standards, those are going to be required to comply by April 29th, 2016. So it's a very aggressive schedule for existing refineries. Note that if you have a vessel that went from Group 2 status in the old definition to the new Group 1 status because of the change in Group 1 definition, then you're allowed to comply with those controls by January 30th of 2026 or by the next time the tank is emptied and degassed. So, but it can be no later than January 30th of 2026. So I wanted to provide you guys my contact information here in case you have any questions. But before you look at that, I wanted to give you guys another poll here. How do you anticipate demonstrating compliance with the new MACT standards? What is your plan of attack? If you could please spend just a quick moment to... Okay, so for those of you who said issuing new work standards for your inspection maintenance group, please be aware that some training ahead of time is very, very effective for your maintenance and inspection groups. Typically, they do not speak the same language as environmental, and if you rely on them to do field verifications of your fittings and controls, it's often that they will come back and with the wrong counts or with wrong information. So a little training on the front end is very helpful. We do that type of training, so if you ever want help for that, let us know. Also, for those of you who want to review your as-built design drawings, note that those are not typically, not always accurate, and that changes are made over time, and that those may not be captured on the drawings. So be real careful about relying on paper. Field verifications are very helpful. If you're going to hire an outside contractor, you know, we can totally help you guys manage the project internally. We also have people who've walked tanks, stood on these floating roofs, got inside the empty degas tanks. We can do that field work for you. And if you haven't thought about it, then you might want to start thinking about it now. Like I said, the compliance schedule is very aggressive. And if it's not your job, then lucky you. So with that, feel free to reach out to me if you have any other detailed questions. Ask them now. If you don't want to ask them now, feel free to contact me. I've included my information and the Director of Air Quality for our company's information here. If you would like a copy of the slide deck, let me know. Shoot me an email. I'll be happy to send you a copy. The slide deck has all those nice pictures and all of the citations listed and the nice table for applicability. Just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to send you the slide deck. Again, thank you for your time today. And I know that Paul wanted to say something about upcoming free webinars as well.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to point out for those of you who are sticking around here that we have 2 scheduled upcoming free webinars, and we'll have more after that. On February 16th, there'll be a webinar by Chris Galligan from RPS-ASA in Rhode Island, talking about consequence modeling for spills from hazardous liquid pipelines, tanks, and rail cars. And then a little change of pace in March, on March 8th, Dr. Taiba Baksh is going to be, also from RPS-ASA in Rhode Island, will be giving a discussion about tsunami hazards and coastal inundation. So it's the sort of thing where if you have the infrastructure, for instance, if you have a refinery along the coastline and you're worried about exposure to risk associated with tsunami or just in general coastal inundation, that will be useful. We now have a few minutes for questions. If any of you in the audience would like to ask questions of Jim, you can please just type them into the chat window. Alternately, you can also contact Jim. His contact information is up on the screen right now. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, I just want to remind you once more that you'll be receiving a short survey, 4 to 5 questions via email after the webinar, and we would appreciate it if you took a minute to answer the questions in the survey and submit your responses back to us so that we can continue to improve these webinars. So we have one request for slides, and I think Jim, do you see that? You can follow up with that.
I do see that. It would be helpful if Chimela would send me an email. That way I have her email address directly, or I can wait until we get the metrics afterwards, and it may take a little longer, and I'll hunt her email, I think it's her email, I'm not sure. Apologize if I got your agenda wrong, but I'll send you the slides later. Or you can send me an email, and then my email address is directly on there.
You mentioned refineries a lot. How do you see this change affecting pipeline storage facilities?
So as I mentioned, the refinery rules tend to portend what happens at terminals, pipeline breakout stations, etc. I would imagine, being that the gasoline distribution GACT rule, the GD GACT rule, also references WW as a control option, I would imagine that over the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to start seeing other sources being pushed towards the MACT WW control requirements. And frankly, I've also got for everybody who asked for the slides, I will also send a quick write-up on the benefits and of switching from NSPSKB to a WW standard. There are very few drawbacks to electing to comply with WW in that the rule is much more clear than NSPSKB. It aligns with EPA and the STIRP agreements, and it's better written than NSPSKB. So again, I would anticipate it in the next few years, being applicable to more sites.
Let's see, we have another question. Have you heard about any possible challenges to this rule that could affect the compliance dates?
I have heard that they are still in process of pulling together comments and or a challenge to some of the compliance deadlines. I wouldn't bank on those being done in time for the first wave. So the real difficulty here is if you have a storage tank that was not in compliance but it was required to be in compliance, getting those on an aggressive schedule now is going to be very difficult, so that you can demonstrate your notification of compliance and initial notification of compliance status. For the storage tanks, luckily, however, that go from Group 2 to Group 1 due to the rule change, those you have plenty of time. But there are some sites out there that may have changes to deal with, and you only have 6 months to a year to get those done. So I would not bank on anything being finalized in terms of a challenge in the next year.
Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, since we have no other questions, if you do have questions, please feel free, I encourage you actually, to contact Jim via email offline after the seminar. And I believe Winnie has just a couple of things to say before signing us all off.